Thank you all for coming today. I know we're all very excited to jump right in, so I'll just introduce our excellent moderator and then move on from there. Professor Melani Cammett is Clarence Dillon Professor of International Affairs in the Government Department at Harvard. She's also the director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. Professor Cammett's research spans identity politics, conflict, development in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as the broader Muslim world. Professor Cammett is also the leading political economics expert at Harvard, and she generously came here after leading a conference just down the street. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conference and this panel. It's really an honor, and it's such an exciting group. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the panel, and then I very much look forward to hearing what they have to say. So the panel is entitled "In the Eye of the Storm: Cities and Climate Change in the Arab World," and we're going to focus on important conversations on mitigation and adaptation regarding climate change, as well as broader issues about action to curb emissions and divestment and so forth. So we'll really be focusing on the urban landscape across the Middle East with respect to climate change. So let me introduce our wonderful speakers. First, we have Karim Elgendy, who is a sustainability and climate expert based in London. He's also Associate Director at Borough Happold and Associate Fellow at Chatham House in London, a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington as well. Karim is the founder and coordinator of Karbun, an advocacy initiative that promotes sustainability in the cities of the Middle East and North Africa through research and communication. His interests include urban sustainability and resilience, climate policy, and energy transition, and has decades of experience also working in other regions around these issues as well. I will not go into the long list of publications and media appearances, but it's quite long. So we're honored to have him here today. Our second panelist is Dr. Yasser Elsheshtawy, who is a non-resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C., and adjunct professor at Columbia University. His scholarship focuses on informal urbanism and environment behavior studies, focusing in particular on Middle Eastern cities. He's also an independent consultant and has worked on many projects in Saudi Arabia, collaborating with renowned architectural and planning practices. He taught for many years at the UAE University and was the curator for the UAE Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2016. He too has authored an enormous number of publications, which I cannot even begin to go through now. He holds a PhD in architecture from the University of Wisconsin, an MA in architecture from Penn State, and a Bachelor of Architecture from Cairo University. So the format for today is each of our panelists will present for about 10 minutes, and then I will have a conversation with them for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. So thank you so much. Please join me.
Okay, so my slide is up, so I think that means I go first. It would be better if I stand up. Does this work? Can you hear me without? No. Is this working? Sorry.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so thank you all for coming out. Thanks, Melani, for the introduction, and thanks to the our conference at Harvard for inviting me. Been asked to do a quick roundup of all these sustainability issues that face the region's cities, and I wanted to tell you a little bit of a story. So about 8,000 years ago, something fascinating happened, rather slow though. The Earth, which spins around its axis, slightly at an angle, 23 degrees or so, shifted ever so slightly, maybe another extra degree or so. And that obviously took a few thousand years to happen, but as a result of this, the entire climate system changed, the way the wind patterns changed, and the whole desert area appeared north and south of the equator. Some of those deserts include parts here in North America, but also the Arabian Desert and the Sahara deserts. But as a result of this, we ended up with a region that lacks the basic fundamentals of human habitation, human settlement. It doesn't have the water, it doesn't have the biocapacity, the ability to produce food, it doesn't have the good weather that allows humans to settle there. So the ability of humans to live in this area was fundamentally at risk at the very time that human civilization started, which is around 10,000 years ago. So human settlements in this region found it really, really difficult to establish, and they could only grow in those just a few locations, those quirks, anomalies even, at the edge of the desert, in certain places in the desert, and those settlements were constrained by those limitations I mentioned, the climate, the water, and the ability to produce food. And they could only grow as much as their immediate hinterland, the areas surrounding the city, can provide those fundamentals. And that growth continued, as I say, constrained by those limitations. Obviously, they will grow where the water is. The settlements will happen where the water is. That goes without saying. There was a preference for coastal areas, but perhaps coastal areas that provide a little bit more, like perhaps port or access to a river. Obviously, groundwater really helps. Even in inland areas, which tend to be a little bit warmer, we found locations that perhaps slightly higher in elevation or near a major river, and those were particularly suited for human settlements as those anomalies that I described. And as a result, you have this network that happened among those cities that helped some of them grow into proper cities, so human settlements turning into cities. And the networks, trade routes essentially, are what allowed places like Ma'rib, and Najran, and Mecca, and Medina, and Tabuk, and Gaza, all to become cities on the frankincense route, allowed places like Ray, and Mosul, and Damascus, and Tripoli to grow along the Silk Route, and allowed places like Mocha, and Jeddah, and Alexandria to emerge on the trade routes, the maritime trade routes. And along this, we had these settlements emerge in a way that demonstrated some of the best vernacular architecture, vernacular urbanism that responded to its climate, lived within its means, so to speak. It can only grow as much as is available in terms of resources, but lived largely within those, in terms of the environmental, the biocapacity, if you like, the constraints, environmental constraints that limit it. And some of those best examples. Something rather quirky happened around the Gulf, which I should caveat here though, that around the same time, about 8,000 years ago, that Gulf didn't even exist at the end of the last ice age. And when the ice caps and the ice around the world at the end of the ice age started melting, water flooded into the Gulf from the Arabian Sea, rose by 125 meters, and created the coastline as we know it. As a matter of fact, it went a little bit higher than the current coastline, about 5,000 years ago, then it came down to where it is, and has been quite steady in the last 2,000 years. And this is when we started putting things on it. So what changed? Industrialization has meant something quite fascinating around the world, that we no longer needed to obtain materials, resources, water, energy from our immediate hinterland. We could get it from anywhere we could afford to. We could ship it from around the world. And as a result, a region that lacks those fundamental resources can now get water from somewhere else in the form of virtual water, food. They can import food. Much of the region imports most of its food. Get a lot of other materials. Can get technology that can help fix issues such as air conditioning, or make the weather slightly more habitable, more tolerable. And it can get technologies such as desalination that makes water in the first place. And it can also borrow water from the future, as in extracting water from deep underground and depleting the aquifers. In other words, borrowing from future generations. And as a result of this, the fundamentals of this region, in terms of environmental consumption, has put it all in debt. It used to have green areas where there was more energy and water, biocapacity and water that allowed it to go on in a sustainable way. No longer does. Now it borrows from the future, so to speak, and it all lives in environmental deficit, if you like. That has happened across the region consistently. And what that meant, two things for cities. It meant an explosion in cities that had trade surpluses, like the Gulf cities, which tended to export energy, fossil fuels. And with that trade surplus, it bought all those things I described. It bought desalination, it bought air conditioning, it bought food, and it bought water from outside of its borders, and exploded in size at a scale several orders of magnitude in the span of only a few decades. And it gave this impression of abundance, which masked the fundamental fragility of those places. But even the locations, the old human settlements I described that had the best models of urbanism, traditional urbanism, those also continued to grow, despite the fact they didn't have the trade surplus, but the consumption of resources continued nonetheless. And the region became very urban, which is all understandable because it's mostly desert, so unlikely people would live in rural areas, but the region is more urban than the global average. 2/3 of the region live in cities, which is more than the 50%, the global 50% or 55%. As a matter of fact, except for Yemen and Egypt, the majority of most countries live in cities, and specifically in the Gulf, where just about everyone lives in cities, mostly around 90%. And the region became an urban region, so to speak. And when we talk about the region and cities in the region, the cities are everything, as a matter of fact. But the region didn't benefit from the things that cities give you. Cities are great. They give you environmental benefits and social benefits. Living in cities is why we come here, because it provides something for us. The regional cities did not provide that. And the reason it didn't provide that is because there are fundamental weaknesses in urban sustainability and urban resilience for the region cities. And I'll go through these hopefully quickly. One fundamental weakness in urban sustainability in the region is that density is very low. And when density is low, you can't walk anywhere. You can't take public transportation anywhere because it's economically unviable. And then with that, you find cities that have single-use planning. So all the offices are over there, and all the houses are over there, and schools are over there. So you have to drive basically everywhere in a route. Well, you couldn't walk if it was all mixed planning type. And then cities were designed for cars. There was very limited public transportation networks, as a matter of fact, and fuel is subsidized, which really removes any incentives for walking or using public transportation or investing in those things. Buildings were particularly bad in the region as well. The decades of poor codes has meant that the buildings are poorly insulated. We have these highly glazed offices that are hardly suited for the region's climate, and the air conditioning kit is really, really inefficient. The region also lacks water, as I described earlier, and it had to rely on things like desalination, which is highly linked to the way energy is produced. So if you transition away from fossil fuel energy, you also have to somehow find a solution for your water, which comes from desalination. And finally, there's a carbon story. The region uses a lot of carbon per capita, and also a lot of carbon per dollar of GDP. And as a matter of fact, in the last 40 years, important 40 years where the region became even more urban, as in transitioning from maybe 40% urban to current 2/3 or 65% urban, those 40 years, the region should have seen an improvement in carbon emissions. It's the only region that during those 40 years became, had more emissions in total, had more emissions per capita, and had more emissions per dollar of GDP. And in terms of urban resilience, also fundamental weaknesses that hold the region back. And just to explain what resilience is the ability of the city to withstand shocks and stresses that kind of disrupt its operations. So the cities of the region have a general weakness in terms of their redundancies and system resilience. So they depend largely on one mode of transportation. So as you've seen, perhaps in recent events, you get a number of traffic incidents in one across a city, say for example due to flooding, and the city comes to a standstill. If it had multiple layers of different modes of transportation, that would give it redundancy, and it could continue to operate. The cities are dependent on one source of water, one source of energy, by and large. and has informalities, plenty of informalities, and informalities are particularly weak and very vulnerable. It's also a fragile social condition in the region, and the continuous growth of population, although slowing down, it's still at a higher rate than we see it in the West. That puts a lot of pressure on cities. Migration and displacement puts additional pressure on the cities, and overall urbanization trends means that you're constantly putting out fires, not being able to plan and look ahead. And finally, conflicts happen in cities across the region, and that presents an unfathomable challenge. Climate change, finally, is a major challenge for the region's cities. The IPCC report tends to say this: it's proportionately affected, and the reason they say that is because things are not favorable in terms of climate change. Other parts of the world will get more rain. The region, specifically the Mediterranean, will get less rain. Yes, it will be more variable, so when it rains, it will rain a lot, but overall, we get less rain. It could actually drop in terms of the amount of water coming down in places that do rain, like Lebanon and the Eastern Mediterranean, and also like Morocco and the Atlas Mountains, by up to 25% and 40%, according to the worst scenarios. That affects agriculture, affects food security, which obviously means that the region and its cities will be dependent on others. It also means that the desert will grow, because if your food production fails, the land will degrade and turn into desert. Temperature will increase. As a matter of fact, it will increase by twice as much as the global average. It's actually the worst rate of increase in temperature in any inhabited region around the world. Yes, the Arctic will be worse, but if any regions are actually where people do live, it'll be the worst one. Inland cities will get affected more, where the temperatures will increase even higher, and the maximum temperatures are specifically going to be really difficult to manage. And then there's that study that came out of the MIT a few years ago that suggested that the combination of temperature and humidity in the worst case scenario by the end of the century could mean that you could die if you're outside for about 6 hours in the shade. Extreme and other events are likely to be higher, as seen in Dubai earlier this week on Tuesday, where it's not unprecedented. We get the same thing in Oman. Basically, the water gets warmer in the Gulf of Oman, and you get the hurricane effect. It pulls the storms in. A few years ago, I had the first time where it came to Muscat directly from the north of Muscat, which is rather unusual, and we had seen the unprecedented storm in Dubai, which caused extensive flooding. I'm not going to go into this because I said a lot about it already in previous occasions, and I only have 10 minutes. And remember this land that grew, this body of water that happened and stayed steady around 2,500 years ago. We've built a lot of stuff around it since then. And we built it right on that coastline. That coastline that just happened is not going to stay there for very long. As a matter of fact, it will continue moving southwards, specifically on the southern littoral, because it's quite flat. So that puts a lot of investments that we have put into the cities and this infrastructure at risk. The particular place at risk is the south of Iraq. I think it's a real risk. Alexandria, obviously, is at risk, but Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha, in the long term, which could be centuries, but once we lock in the emissions today, there's no going back from that. For centuries, it's a bizarre thing where decisions we make in the 2020s will determine what will happen up to the year 3,500, 4,000. It's a really, really bizarre concept to get your head around. But in the long term, those locked-in emissions will result in this, will result in that extensive kind of inundation. And of course, Alexandria seems to be the poster child, so to speak, for this because of its natural low-lying land. The delta specifically of Egypt is because it's actually below sea level already. That makes it more at risk from this inundation. And places that were built in the water or very close to the water or reclaimed land, for example, here in Dubai or in Doha, are particularly at risk. So how do you get our head around this? It seems insurmountable. Let me just make it a little bit more complicated. this idea of turning our world and our cities into a more sustainable model, and I will end with this, is a fairly Western idea. So it's the idea that we can tinker with our systems a little bit every year, improve it marginally, say 5% every year, until we get to steady state sustainability, where we live within our norms. But this region has too much disruption. It has population growing too fast. It has, compared to other parts of the world, those Western countries where the population can be managed to stay where it is, has migration, has military conflicts, and has extreme weather events that continue to happen and have happened in the past, even before climate change, so dust storms, for example. And then you have the other, this idea that you're going to bounce back in resilience. So something terrible happens, say a storm or an earthquake, and then you want to bounce back from that to restore operation. The problem with this in this region is that you're restoring back to something that is really, really not adequate, not sustainable. So you bounce back, but you never really liked what you're bouncing back to in the first place. So you kind of need to find out some new way for the cities of this region where they'll be able to manage these shocks and these stresses, these challenges that they face in a way that takes them to a new place that is more sustainable. And vice versa, you need to develop sustainability that becomes more resilient and more able to withstand those shocks. On the upside, if you leave everything as is, in about 30,000 years or so, the Earth axis will go back, just because it will, okay? And when that happens, you'll get that conversion back from the savannas that we had 8,000 years ago, and the deserts will go away, and it will get greener, and there'll probably be more water, more rainfall, and there'll be more food. But if you are unwilling to wait, this decade specifically is the time to act. Thank you all very much.
This isn't working. Or should I just go?
I would try.
This one here? All right. All right, so thank you, Melani, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming today. And I also wanted to thank the organizers for this conference. It's really an honor to be here. Yeah, they have. All right, so we're back on. I'll be talking about Arab Gulf cities and specifically exploring the notions of environmental resilience and social justice. And I would like to start with this image right here, which is of the city of Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. And the image really captures all that is wrong with cities in the Arabian Peninsula. In the middle of this image, we see the King Abdullah Financial District, massive development that has started a few years ago and is now on the verge of being completed. But then more significantly, around that mega development is this endless expansion into the desert through these super blocks. And these super blocks contain freestanding villas, housing for Saudi nationals, and then we have all of these highways. It is an image that captures the nature of cities in that region. They are in a desert environment. There is hardly any green space, and it's really difficult to imagine that there's any sort of public life that takes place in an environment like that. It seems quite desolate and deprived of any sort of liveliness or urbanity as we typically see it. Now, when we look at other cities in the region, like Abu Dhabi, for example, the picture doesn't really get much better. There's also this endless expansion into the desert, away from the city, literally inscribing lines in the sand, all because of a housing policy that assures and guarantees a freestanding villa to every national in that part of the world. And of course, these sort of images undermine the very notions of sustainability and resilience, even though officials in these urban centers would claim that they are adhering to sustainability standards and that these various villas are using photovoltaic cells and what have you, but still it is an environment and a development that is car-centric and dependent on car movement. So there are a couple of facts here. First is that the Middle East is warming at twice the global average, and by 2050 will be 4 degrees Celsius warmer as compared with the 1.5 degree mark that scientists have prescribed to save humanity. And the World Bank argues that extreme climatic conditions will become routine, and the region could face 4 months of scorching sun every year, basically temperatures making it very uninhabitable, which is what the German Max Planck Institute is also arguing, that many cities in the Middle East may literally become uninhabitable before the end of the century. And we see that right now. We see temperatures in Kuwait, for example, can exceed 60 degrees centigrade. This is a temperature that it's really unimaginable that anybody could live in an environment like that. I personally have lived in the UAE, in the city of Al Ain, for many years, and in the summer, temperatures would routinely go above 50 degrees centigrade. And just spending a few seconds in the sun is really life-threatening. The region is, of course, also susceptible to the impact of climate change, as we have seen in the Dubai floods that happened just a few days ago, where the city literally was submerged in water. Now, any city in the world with that kind of rainfall that suddenly happened overnight would be subject to hardship. You've seen that in New York City during Hurricane Katrina and so on. But Dubai sort of portrays itself as this sort of model of urban excellence, and events like that expose the city's vulnerability. And it is not just the physical environment that suffers, but it's also the city's most vulnerable residents, the city's invisible labor force, workers who are imported from in South Asia, from India and Pakistan, and they're the ones who are doing all the cleanup of this and clearing all the debris, while the wealthy and the Emiratis, they live comfortably in their villas, and within a few days, all of the effect of that storm is gone. But then what happened to the workers who live in worker camps and are, of course, also subject to these same events? Another set of facts is that as of 2023, the UAE had the world's 3rd highest per capita carbon dioxide emission rate. And I'm talking here about the UAE specifically, the UAE is also one of the world's top consumers of water per capita. And 90% of the UAE's potable water needs are met through energy-intensive desalination. And before I talk about this further, there's also this belief that the UAE and other countries in the region can, through technology and various processes, can alleviate the effect of climate change and claim to be sustainable. And to that end, they are investing in carbon capture, a technology that claims that it can reduce the CO2 emissions from the atmosphere, and also carbon credits. And in that instance, countries like the UAE have bought 25 million hectares of land in Africa, in Zambia, Tanzania, Liberia, and Zimbabwe. And buying land there is sort of a way to redevelop that land, and through that they can get carbon credits and use that to offset any negative impact they have through their developments. Of course, that's kind of like a pipe dream. Many have debunked that this actually is effective in any way. And more significantly, when countries like the UAE buy land in Africa, they are, in many instances, using that to develop luxurious resorts, plant vegetation that is not native to the land, which causes all sorts of havoc. And more significantly, native populations are displaced from their land. And that has happened, has been documented quite extensively. So to continue, I'll be talking about two issues that I think are quite relevant in a discussion of this subject, mainly the notion of inequality and also housing and greenwashing. And inequality, I'll be talking about 2 points. The first is about public space, and the second is about housing. So first, public space, or the erosion of public space. The United Nations in 2016 introduced the new urban agenda, which is an agenda that contained a series of provisions for having a just and resilient city, and that citizens should have access to equal opportunities, and that there should be a full respect for the rights of refugees, migrants, and internally displaced people, and that cities should contain provisions for improving connectivity and support of green initiatives. So public space is important, and in a city like Dubai, which has all these spectacular developments, there is a clear deficiency of having of true public spaces, except in very some exceptional circumstances, like we see in Dubai here. This it's called the Khazan Park, a small neighborhood park, which is really lovely and open, but it is in an upscale neighborhood and caters to more upscale residents. However, the city's marginalized population are left to use sidewalks, empty lots. They don't really have access to the kind of public space or amenities that are provided for the city's more wealthier residents. And in the case of Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, for example, this is an image that shows a group of migrant workers congregating on a sidewalk next to a park called Futa Park, and one of the oldest parks in Riyadh. And this is the place where they come together and they hang out, but obviously it is not sufficient for enabling a true public realm. The other issue that contributes to inequality is housing and segregation. And urban policies throughout the region favor segregation among residents. And the housing policy is predicated on providing locals with living spaces comprised of standalone, spacious villas, whereas workers are relegated to camps located at the fringes of cities or deep in the desert, far away from urban centers. And stateless people, or Bidoon, as we see in Kuwait and Bahrain, live in slum-like settlements on the city's outskirts. And these are two examples here. On the left is an image of a labor camp in Dubai, and very typical of these labor camps, it contains these dormitory units or cells that contain sometimes 12 to 20 people living in these dormitories, quite dire conditions. This is basically the place where they live and work, and the only instance where they are actually accessing the city is when they are being bused to the various construction sites where they work. And of course, in an environment like that, they are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, like flooding, for example. The other example on the right is a very typical neighborhood in Kuwait that contains the Bedouin, or the stateless people. And we see that in Bahrain as well, and these areas or neighborhood are as close as you can get to a slum in these countries, and the environment is obviously quite deteriorating and not really suitable for a human habitation. But again, it sort of highlights the extent of segregation that exists in these urban centers, and how the city's most vulnerable residents are relegated to the city's outskirts, away from the spectacular city. And finally, I want to talk about greenwashing. And that is something that we see is quite pervasive and prevalent in the region. Taking Dubai again as an example, this is an image of Business Bay, a massive development that was built over the last few years in the city. And we have all these very nice buildings and skyscrapers, and on the face of it, it's obviously something that goes against any principles of urban sustainability. However, officials will claim that all of these buildings adhere to the highest standards of sustainability, that electricity is generated through photovoltaic cells, water is recycled, there are provisions for bikes and storage areas for bikes, and then you tick all these boxes and you get all these points, and then suddenly you have a gold rating of sustainability, which of course does not address the very issue why you build something like that in the first place. So it is a process of greenwashing, where you adopt the rhetoric of sustainability, but then the actual developments or what happens on the ground undermines that very notion. The other example that I think is quite relevant in this context, and is a good example of greenwashing as well, is Masdar City, that was designed by Foster Architects. And this is a rendering of the initial vision. This was a city that was planned on the outskirts of Abu Dhabi, a city that would generate zero waste, use zero energy from conventional sources, where there's no cars are below ground and in parking garages, and movement is on foot or through electric vehicles. So this is the initial vision that was presented and portrayed in the media, showing that Abu Dhabi is the poster child of environmental sustainability, and using urban planning principles that adopt or follow principles of sustainability. The reality, of course, is that none of that was built at all. In fact, when you go there now, this is what you see. Only a very small segment of that city has been built. A research center, which was the headquarters of Khalifa University. They have since moved out. Headquarters for Siemens, and headquarters for IRENA, a UN-based energy agency. But then all around it is desert, and the rest is being used for a very conventional real estate development, freestanding villas sold to investors. Of course, the developer claimed that this new development adheres to the highest possible sustainability standards. Again, it's simply a matter of greenwashing. So there is also a political dimension to this. The sustainability narrative in the region is used by political regimes to convey an image of modernity, technological pioneering, and welfare surplus, thus cementing their legitimacy and power. And ruling elites derive more legitimacy from encouraging unrestrained lifestyles than from adhering to the pursuit of urban sustainability. And there is a reliance on technological solutions, like carbon capturing or carbon credits or whatever, and the promotion of miraculous mega projects like Masdar, rather than actually changing consumer behavior. And this focus on technology allows authorities to claim and adherence to the global sustainability agenda, but it ultimately sidesteps the social dimension. So there is a need for a paradigm shift. And that is achieved by recognizing the rights of migrants through integration into society. And that subsidies for locals need to be rethought. And that housing policies should promote integration. And that urban planning needs to shift away from car-centric developments. And that authorities and governments in the region need to build and expand on local capacities rather than importing Western expertise. Without recognizing this, the city of the future risks becoming the utopia of the few and the dystopia of the many. And I'll leave you with this image right here. I was in Riyadh a few months ago for work on a project that is going to be built there, a massive city. And I asked my host to take me to the site of the Muka'ab project, or the Cube. And I'm not sure if you heard of that project. It has a footprint of 400 by 400 meters, 400 meter high. Inside that cube is a skyscraper, 100 stories high. Supposedly people will be living there. Of course, when they live in a skyscraper like that, inside a closed cube, when you look out the window, you'll see a blank wall. So the planners envisions AI-generated imagery that will be projected showing like a rainfall or a snowstorm or tropical environment or what have you. This is a serious project, and unfortunately I was involved as one of the competitors that were invited, part of a consortium, to submit proposals to authorities. We didn't win, thank God, but I asked my host to take me to the site, and it is currently under construction. And right across from that site, I saw this image right here. And it really showed to me and captured really what I was trying to say today, that some of the city's most vulnerable residents are simply left behind. And in this case here, we have this veiled woman. I'm not sure, she could be a migrant from Yemen or a poor Saudi widower sitting on the sidewalk selling snacks and drinks to passers-by. And in order for the region and for cities in the region to really move beyond the current model and the paradigm, they need also to take into account the plight of its most vulnerable residents. So thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, thank you so much. I learned a tremendous amount, and I don't think we have the luxury of waiting 30,000 years for the earth to tilt. So in the spirit of the focus of this panel on adaptation, mitigation, I want to pose some questions in that direction. I'll pose just one or two questions to each of our panelists so we have time to open it up to your questions and discussion. Starting with Karim, you mentioned that you focus on the hardware, on the infrastructure, on water, sanitation, that sort of thing. And your presentation highlighted certain factors that work against adaptation and mitigation, like the failure to promote density and the single-use zoning and that sort of thing. So I wonder if we could talk about examples where you've seen success in this area, if they exist at all, and what do you think it takes policy-wise to move in this direction, to address some of the structural hardware features that lessen the ability of urban environments in the Middle East to adapt?
Okay, so there are some good examples. I mean, obviously they're rare. There was an attempt to do something not too dissimilar, higher density, albeit for the few, in downtown Doha, which I thought was from a hardware perspective, good on energy efficiency and water efficiency, less dependent on vehicles, etc. There was a good restoration of an ecosystem in Riyadh, a few years back in Wadi Hanifa, which Yasser might be familiar with. Again, creating public space, perhaps also for local Saudis who can afford such luxury, and specifically Saudi families, but certainly regenerative in nature. It improves an amenity and improves provisions for locals. Some interesting examples in Morocco. These are the city scale. There are obviously developments on renewables nationally in a bunch of countries. Cite Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, UAE, and now Saudi potentially, maybe. The goals are really large. There's plenty to say. There's produced a series of videos, 2-minute videos that highlight all the positive developments for the different systems, different networks, different issues that you highlighted here. I'd be happy to share those rather than go through the list here.
Okay, yeah. And just to push a little bit further, what does it take to change the policies around zoning and that sort of thing? What are the obstacles?
So zoning is a difficult one. Actually, changing cities is a really difficult thing. Existing cities are much harder to deal with, which sometimes explains why policymakers decide, you know what, let's just leave it as is. We've been going over there, we're building something new, and we saw that in Saudi, Jordan, and Egypt, where there's efforts to build brand new cities that avoid quote-unquote mistakes of the past and doing something fresh. It's a tempting idea because urban retrofits are extremely difficult. But specifically on the issue of zoning, the American example is great. Can't fix LA or Vegas or Phoenix or any of those places. They're just unfixable. There's no way we could get a bus to run in a profitable way, just because people live in those houses and the density is really low, so only a few people will get on the bus, so the bus is not going to make enough money, so it's going to make less stops, it's going to have less routes, and we're going to get even less people riding the bus, and it just spirals down. No one's going to invest in transit, as in heavy transit, like metro networks, because there's resistance in the same way there is in the Gulf towards public transportation. And as a matter of fact, there has been some incidents, say, in Florida, where the locals would say, well, why would the local authority spend money on public transportation? Let's just subsidize $5 for every Uber drive, and or every Uber ride. And apparently that worked in some places. The point I'm trying to make here is that there's a lot of resistance to this retrofitting, this fixing existing cities on that front. However, in Riyadh, there was a large scale, the biggest construction, I think Dr. Yasser did a video on that recently, the construction of 6 lines in Riyadh, all in one go. The metro, yep. There was 4-line metro in Doha that was built, again, all in one go. There's expansions in Morocco of light rail. There's BRT in Amman, in Jordan. So there are surgical attempts. Do these fix everything? No, they don't. Specifically this issue of zoning. I think this issue of zoning that you pointed to is a particularly difficult one. But some see public transportation as a way of doing this, and some of the easiest things that you could do rather than fix large scale the whole city.
Thanks. So Yasser, I want to turn, you highlighted sort of micro level factors that push against changing adaptation processes and mitigation. So these micro level incentives at the level of consumers to continue in the villas and leading this lifestyle. And these are hard to change. We know this the world over. And none of these problems, as you pointed out with the examples of Phoenix and LA, are unique to the Middle East. It just seems that this region, unfortunately, as you pointed out, has 2 times the global temperature rise, as if the region needed yet another challenge. So how do you get at this micro level behavioral change? Do you have any insights about how you push people to embrace the possibility of a lifestyle change that would be more in line with the realities of the region?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there are several ways to respond to that. As I was saying in my presentation, it's for regimes in the region, it is not in their current interest to force change or to enable change. For example, the housing policy, the provision of freestanding villas or land plots where locals can build these massive mansions, is something through which the regime legitimizes its rule and assures the loyalty of its citizens. If they begin to suggest alternative modes of living and sort of force people to, for example, live in downtown in high-rise multi-level apartment blocks and so on, there will be resistance. People don't want that. And so they are very sensitive to that. But the example Karim mentioned, for instance, the Musharraf development in Doha, downtown Doha, was a sincere attempt by authorities in Qatar to give an incentive to Qataris to live an alternative housing typology, like in an apartment. The reality is the project was completed, it looks beautiful, it's very nice, but no Qatari resident actually lives there. This is a place for expatriates, people who work in universities there are given housing by universities. The only time, and I was there a few months ago, when there are Qataris is when they are out in the evening to frequent the high-end cafes and restaurants and Versace stores and boutiques. I mean, it's a super exclusive place. You go there, it's kind of empty in many ways. So that's a problem. And again, as Karim was saying about the Riyadh Metro project, it's obviously a magnificent feat of infrastructure development, right? But the only way it works, and currently the percentage of Saudis or percentage of people in Riyadh who use public transportation is about 2%. And they want to increase that to 20 and 30%. But the only way you can do that is to disincentivize people from using cars. And cities and other parts in the world, like in London, you have a congestion fee, right, to enter downtown, to enter center of London. So you need to do that. You need to minimize parking. You need to have show real intent that people should not use their car. And the metro should not just be for expatriates and for low-income workers, but even for regular Saudis. And the Saudi government has provided the infrastructure. There is a metro, but there's also a BRT, a bus rapid transit network, bike lanes, and there are other projects that are taking place to sort of capitalize on that. So that needs to happen. But the current situation, when you look at sort of the policies, and it's not really happening. These projects are there as showcase projects to convey an image of modernity, greenwashing in some way, but as of yet, there is no real desire to fundamentally change the direction of the policy.
Great, so maybe I'll just pose one more question to each of you. I know I'm conscious of the time, but we started a little bit late, so maybe we can have a few minutes extra. Okay, so one quick question. Greenwashing has come up repeatedly, and we were speaking before the panel began about variation across the region in adaptation and the adoption of renewables and that sort of thing. So I'm wondering if you can comment, Karim, on variation across the region, cross-nationally and then cross-municipally as well, in adoption of renewables, and and also particularly on net energy exporters who have less immediate dire pressing need to do this. Why are we seeing this happening?
Sure. Well, some of this is national level, obviously. So I'll get the cities out of the way. Some cities are more empowered by their ability to have their own regulations at the city scale. So for example, Dubai is a real anomaly here because it's both an emirate and a city, and it can enforce its own rules. Cairo, for example, doesn't have that capability. It can't have its own rules. The ministries dictate what happens and what doesn't happen. So there are cities without powers who are unable to create their own rules. So when you look at which cities are going faster in terms of transition towards more sustainability and resilience. We should not be distracted by the lack of powers to determine which ones are doing better, which ones' hearts are in the right place. That's always a risk that we have to bear in mind. Moroccan city centre do very well because there's a decentralization effort by the government there, and had been for quite a while, that has given plenty of powers to Moroccan cities and localities to do that. On the national plan, specifically you mentioned renewables, there is a clear desire amongst energy importers, the non-fossil fuel exporters of the region, to move away in terms of electricity generation towards renewables. And obviously, it's, everything you generate is something that you don't import from overseas, so it reduces your trade imbalance, etc. So there's an advantage in energy security and advantage in economics. And the energy exporters are fascinating, and as you pointed out, that you find countries like the UAE, Qatar, and now Saudi Arabia, which has really aggressive plans to go from 1%, I believe, renewables today to 50% in the next 6 years. And the reason they do this is because every barrel that they burn internally is a barrel that they cannot export. And there's an urge to get those barrels onto the market today, to get them sold, not use them internally. So use renewables internally, decarbonize your economy, diversify your economy internally, move away from fossil fuels, your dependence internally, but get these barrels on ships and get them to someone else to buy them now, because we need that money. That money we're just going to export these fossil fuels for, in order to fund all of this transition internally that we're trying to do. The transition is really, really urgent, and if the world doesn't buy these barrels today, they might not buy it next decade, and because the customer is moving away. There's a consensus now. The world is not going to buy this fossil fuel for much longer, so we better get them on ships today, get the money from those, and help transition away from carbon-intensive industries internally. It's a race against time.
Great, thank you. And okay, one last question for Yasser. You've highlighted social inequalities in the impact of climate change and the current state of cities in the region. What kind of efforts are taking place at the grassroots level to mobilize to address these inequalities? What's the landscape of civil society mobilizing around these issues?
Well, the short answer is there's none. It's not particularly in the Gulf. It's autocratic regimes, and any attempts at pointing out the inequalities and injustices that exist, and that they need to address them more effectively and not just in a cosmetic way like they're doing now, is dealt with quite severely. It's one of the reasons why I left the region. I lived there for more than 20 years, and this was the subject of my research, and my hope always was that nobody in the UAE would actually read what I'm writing, and it became even more sensitive following the Arab Spring, because there was really scrutinized, and the fear is that if you begin to point out these social inequalities and the ridiculousness of, for example, declaring a neighborhood as being exclusively reserved for nationals, that you are being seen as undermining the policies of the leadership. But there are some attempts, there are some at the sort of community level for people to alleviate the suffering of workers, to provide them with food and shading areas, places where they can work. There are some policies now are in place that prevent workers from working midday in this hot summer month, so that they are not suffering from the effect of the heat. But it's obviously not enough. And for real change to happen, there needs to be a real change in the entire political context.
Okay, so we have some time to open it up, so why don't we take a few questions in the interest of time? Can we go like 10 minutes over, or that's okay? Or, okay, Great. So why don't we take, I'll just go geographically from right to left. So we'll start with you and we'll take a few others. Yes. In the yellow sweater, yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. Do you hear me? Yes.
No.
Speak up a little, please.
So, postdoc at CMES, I'm between GS Graduate School of Design and the Center
Can we get a microphone or something?
Oh,
It's
yeah.
really difficult.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So I work on similar issues, but on North Africa, the Tunisian context, and I see so much connections and similarities between the two contexts. And so what I'm missing, for example, for my context, usually when you search for data for North Africa climate projections, we cannot find any, or not accurate ones that landscape designers or architects or urban planners could use to think about the future of our cities. So how can we bridge that gap? And I'm also interested in the role of design in supporting grassroots movements. So actually in North Africa we have at the beginning of a political ecology, people fighting for their livelihood. So I'm interested in the oasis and process of land grabbing and water dispossession in the south of Tunisia, the imminent collapse of oasis. We're talking about 2030s. So don't you think there is a crisis of imagination, like the colonization of spirits, because there is this overlooking of ancient indigenous solutions that are easy to implement, and people want balconies, they want air conditioning, they want modern houses that are ill-suited. So like we pass from water commoning to water contest, and everybody is conscious, like know that there is an imminent collapse of the system, but the state centralization is blocking everything. So like now I'm trying to work on a community level, but we need scalable solutions. So how can we move from a community level to policy guidelines? Like, is there a bottom-up process we should implement or something like this? Because it's scary. So.
And let's take two more. Yes, the two men in the back. Yeah, thank you. Well, we're gonna just.
شكرا يا أستاذ ياسر، شكرا يا أستاذ كريم. Thank you, Professor Cammett. I'm actually just curious if you have a view on whether increased regulation and central planning is important, or whether actually deregulation would be important in terms of achieving things like affordable housing or density, which would enable public transportation, if some of the problem is attributable to bad regulation right now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And just pass the mic, and then you guys can answer, and we'll go over here after.
Thank you very much for your talks. So I'm interested in urban health in particular, and the question I had was, the policies you were recommending seem to be very top-down, and as you were saying with the example of Qatar, they built the buildings, nobody comes. What is the role of actually growing demand? Because the idea of having the freestanding villas is created by that is our perception of success or moving up. What is the role of arts, the community, that sort of thing? And it comes to mind Hassan Fathi's sort of commentary for me as an Egyptian. We haven't had actual Egyptian urbanism since Muhammad Ali. We've just been importing it. How do you start growing it locally? Because if we keep measuring success by the yardstick of the West, the politicians will respond to that. And it seems to be very much, the similar recommendation is still very autocratic. Develop a policy, force it on the people, and they'll follow it. If we're looking at recycling, use of tote bags, all of this, social pressure of side-eye when you go to the farmer's market was much better at getting people to adopt it rather than actually saying, oh, it costs 7 cents. It's only when it surpasses this that it becomes effective. So how do you collaborate with other partners, whether they're in the arts or healthcare or anything, to actually push this rather than going just to the politicians who will not pass policy that is going to make them unpopular? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Would you want to?
Yeah, just let me respond quickly. I think that three questions are sort of have sort of common theme, and if I start with the gentleman from Tunis, I know that in Tunis there's the Lake Tunis project, right? That's currently under development or completed, I'm not sure. But developments like that are really symptomatic of the extent by which the urban model in the Gulf has captured our urban imaginary. And we see this not just in Tunis, but also in Morocco, in Rabat, the development along the Boulegreg River, in Cairo, the new administrative capital. They are all exemplify this fascination with Dubai as a model. And Dubai might work in Dubai, right, or in the UAE. It's has very specific social conditions. But then when we come to the more sort of traditional centers of the Arab world, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Iraq, Syria, it's a very different story. And it's an attempt by the regimes to convey an image of progress and modernity, but it really is at the heart of it about making profits. And it is predicated on a model of neoliberal urbanization. And we see that all over the world. So it's not like a Dubai thing, it's just that Dubai really exemplifies or is a model for how it has been implemented in the region. So there needs to be a move away from that, a move away from centralization, like the gentleman was asking. I don't have a good answer here. There was an attempt to do that in Egypt in the revolution in 2011. That was squashed, and now we have one of the most oppressive regimes in the country's history, and it's building this ridiculous capital in the desert, the sole objective of which is to protect itself from its own people. There's no other really way to justify this. So that would be my quick answer.
Okay, I'm going to take the second two. We're more or less along the same lines. So we elect politicians, or they elect themselves, to implement policies for everyone, right? So we can't have policy, everyone for their own policy, right? So there's a need for some element of top-down regulations, policy making in there. What we do not want to see is one that doesn't take into account the wider views of people who live either at municipal level or city level or at national level. And there's a need for more stakeholder engagement, not symbolic stakeholder engagement, but real stakeholder engagement with civil society, academia, and the private sector. And at the moment we're not seeing this, largely within the world of climate action and the policies that I work on, like climate and energy, and then cities. So even municipalities don't engage, and national governments don't engage municipalities and cities when they do put national level policies in place. So that's what I would like to see. The second level from this stakeholder engagement is something that I would consider to be a dream, which is called participatory planning, where you're not just consulting them, they're actually active participants in a process that is facilitated by the policymakers. So the policymakers are get everyone around the table, not just listen to them, but let them help shape it. And that's, in my view, that would be the next level. Let's stick with stakeholder engagement for now, do that, and see if we can move on to the next level afterwards. But regulation is not bad, necessarily, and the world we're currently in is in such a pickle that it needs bold and decisive action within the next 2 years and also up to the 2030 horizon. If we wait until we all collectively as individuals agree on anything, I think we'll wait we might wait for 30,000 years actually.
And then the problem solved. Okay, so yes, in the front.
Try and speak loud. Thank you. Do you believe that there are potential solutions to? Oh, it's not on.
Why don't you take this one for now?
Hello. Thank you. Do you believe there are potential solutions to find when looking back at older architecture and infrastructure in the region? And do you believe that these solutions from the older technologies can be integrated into the cities currently? So working with these technologies that have been developed over thousands of years of civilizations in the area. So.
I can take that one. That's an
Okay,
easy one.
can I just take a few others, because
Yes,
I know
of course.
there's big
Yep.
demand. Okay, a question from you, and then in the back, and then you can answer.
If they're directed to me.
Yeah, okay.
I'll try to keep it quick given the demand. Crystal Stabell, doing nuclear energy with the Bechtel Corporation, but I'm very interested in what we're doing with NEOM as well. A lot going on. My question regards specifically the economic trade-offs that come from the sustainable energy movement, especially in the Middle East. You could possibly get rid of the subsidies or put some sort of cap on carbon, but then that's going to be expensive in order changing people's habits, as you previously mentioned. Or if you want to have government subsidized projects like with Saudi Arabia and its solar energy, then that's going to be cheap in the short term, but in the long term, it's going to be not matching the market prices as if it was a free project. So I'm curious to hear from you, what should policymakers be taking into account when it comes to the trade-offs, especially when you come from a less economically well-off country that might not be able to give the subsidies, for example?
Okay, and one question in the back, and then I'll turn it over, and I think we'll have to wrap up at that point, or we can squeeze in one more. Okay, two more questions.
Hello. First of all, thank you so much for this beautiful both presentation you guys gave. My name is Mohammed Adil. I'm from Oman, Sultanate Oman. I work in the renewable sector. I left Oman 10 years ago working in a sense that, in a hopeless sense, that nothing can be changed, especially in the sector that I'm trying to work in. Came to the US, thought that I would come back 20 years later to be a force of change, to be able to change once I'm ready. Of course that changed. I realized, climate change doesn't wait. We need to be making actions. And I also found myself in recent years, specifically this year, pulled back into Oman, face to face with decision makers, with policy makers in Sultanate Oman. Now my question to both of you is, how do we, especially people here might also relate to this, younger generation, how do we influence without authority? So we're still not there yet in terms of having the authority to change these policies, to push for the right change in terms of urban planning, in terms of pushing for adopting more sustainable projects. How do we influence the current situation in our countries, even though we don't have the authority?
Okay, thank you. And one final question. Do you want to just take mine?
Thank you very much for a very sobering and scary series of presentations. I guess it's clear that there's an absurdity to the situation. It's very clear that the consequences are incredibly dire and a lot closer than people would like to think. And the consequences we live across the region, I think we're all pretty familiar with. And and clearly in all of this, we're talking about authoritarian regimes, so it seems almost absurd to talk about solutions. It seems to me, in the presence of those authoritarian regimes. So that seems to me part of the solution, and I'm not an expert. But I guess one of the things we haven't talked about, which I'm wondering from your experience, is about the ecosystem, if you like, if it goes a lot broader. We talked about Norman Foster. But in terms of the neoliberal and the relationship with capital as it goes way beyond the region, because that seems the primary driver. And what you can say about that, and where that money goes, and its relationship with the global systems that seem to me the more likely places for structures of accountability to strike.
I'll take the first two, you take the second two.
Okay, so
Yeah, we'll have to split it somehow.
responses.
Okay, so the first question is yes. Should we- If anyone remembers the question, yes. I think what you were asking is, did we learn anything from the traditional urbanism that was in the region, where people lived, as you say, thousands of years, obviously happily? I think there's an element of romanticism in this, but there's a lot to learn. So yes, there was ways in which traditional cities or settlements were created. They were not designed, but they were created slowly, organically, in a way that managed heat slightly better, shaded slightly better, allowed air to move slightly better, and it made what is otherwise a very hot temperature just hot, right? And that's not to say that everyone was comfortable. We have now, in the modern world, decided what comfort is, right? So it's a temperature range. It's 25 to 21 degrees Celsius. This is when you're comfortable. Anything above that, you're not comfortable. But obviously, these people managed to, through free design, basically. There was no cost associated with finding ways in which you could capture air at high levels and bringing it down and cooling it with a little bit of water to improve indoor temperature from 40 to 30. But we shouldn't romanticize it too much, because 30 is still too hot, according to our comfort standards today, right? So there's principles that have been established and are well documented in the research today, and we could implement those things essentially for free to create better urbanism in current practice of planning and in architecture. But I'm just warned about is not to go down the Hassan Fathy route and romanticize it too much and think that the solution is just to revert to the way people lived for thousands of years happily and comfortably. I think that's not quite accurate. On renewables, I actually disagree. I don't think there's any subsidies on renewables in the region. As a matter of fact, Saudi Arabia recently commissioned a private contractor to build a solar array for 1 cent per kilowatt hour of electricity generated. Just for context, that's cheaper than anything of any kind of electricity generation. Like, it's cheaper than coal, cheaper than gas, cheaper than absolutely everything. Unheard of, essentially, in terms of cost. But wind was commissioned for 2 cents per kilowatt hour. Again, exceptionally clear. You get the same costs in Mexico or in Portugal, where it gets really sunny as well. So there is no issue with this in terms of cost. The issue is scaling and also with storage overnight. So there's a limit. You could use renewables up to say 11–12% of your total generation just goes into the grid, and there's no issue. Once it goes beyond that, then you kind of need to find ways in which you can store it overnight and use it later. There's some management issues associated, some upgrades to the grid to make it more versatile with using the renewable energy at scale, much larger scale than the threshold I've just described now. Batteries are a big solution, and so far the batteries are still expensive. As anyone who has bought an electric car knows, batteries are very expensive. They're about a third of the cost of electric cars. So when that comes down, and it's supposed to come down any minute now, then those solutions, those storage solutions, will mitigate the intermittence that comes with solar and wind, because the sun sets and the wind doesn't blow sometimes. So that's always a concern. But in terms of economics, no one is questioning economics. The S-curve of maturity of renewable energy technology is complete. I mean, there's no stopping it. And the IAA tells us as much. Tells us the question is whether we will triple renewables capacity by 2030 rather than 2.5x. Right. This is the space we're operating in. Whether the market forces on their own will get us to 2.5 times, or whether we can push it a little bit to 3. But no one is saying that renewables are a challenge or something that is holding us back. So I take a little bit of issue with the premise of your question there.
Okay. Yasser, you have the last word.
Yeah. So there were the two comments regarding how can we influence the current situation, and also the neoliberal urban model within the context of authoritarian regimes and so on. Just a few words to that. Obviously, the extent by which you can influence current urban policy relies on the political context. But the neoliberal urbanization model has really a very sort of seductive appeal. And people like David Harvey, an urban economist, talked about, he popularized the term neoliberal urbanization, talked about urban revolutions, that's really the only way by which we can move forward. And we have seen examples of this in the Black Lives Matter movement, in Occupy Wall Street, in the marches and demonstrations that took place in Hong Kong a few years ago, particularly around the years of the pandemic and all of that. But in all of these instances, there was an absorption by the regimes and authorities of these movements, co-opting them in some way and undermining the very notion of change that they were trying to accomplish. And to my mind, and that's something I'm trying to do through my own practice, is that rather than confronting authorities and regimes head on, try to work with them. Try to find a way by which you can suggest policies that are more empathetic, policies that are more inclusive. And that's something that I've been trying to do in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. And it is really my belief that this is a more effective way forward. Obviously, a revolution and a complete change in the system would be much better. But given the current situation, that may seem unrealistic. So I think we need to find another way, a way to work with authorities and trying to get our point across, and step by step, I think change can be achieved.
Great, well, thank you so much to our excellent panelists and to the audience.